The first days after the second autumn flood brought a peculiar stillness to the Sabine River, a stillness so profound that even the mule drivers who spent their lives along its shifting banks remarked upon it with an uneasy tilt of the head, as if the very air had thickened into something sentient. In the late 1870s, the river towns of East Texas bore the exhausted gait of regions that had survived war without ever truly recovering from it. Their surviving men walked with the grim expression of those who understood intimately the cost of each mile of soil, while the women moved in quiet routines that revealed years of unrecorded burdens. The Sabine itself seemed to roll under this collective weight, its surface often broken only by drifting branches or the slow drag of an empty skiff. And in this unsettled atmosphere, created by the collapse of institutions, the ineffective presence of sheriffs stretched too thin across too many miles of pine forest, and the persistence of wartime scars that never fully healed, there existed the silent knowledge that a single figure had slipped free from the grasp of order and had retreated into the labyrinth of swamp and cedar thickets. He was a man without a recorded name, a man whose presence lingered only in fragments of rumor, and yet whose shadow disrupted the fragile equilibrium that the region had been trying, year after year, to construct. Before his escape, he had been known only as a convict assigned to the river transport detail, a position reserved for those with a familiarity, sometimes inherited, sometimes purchased at great personal cost, with the unpredictable channels of the Sabine. Older men along the river insisted they remembered him before imprisonment, when he still worked as a river guide, leading flatboats through shifting currents, reading wind by the movement of reeds, and navigating the unpredictable shoals that made commerce hazardous during certain months. They described him as a quiet figure, introspective, broad-shouldered but thin, a man who carried the scent of the river in his clothing and the weight of something unspoken in his eyes. Yet the prison system of the era did not preserve such descriptions. It flattened human beings into laboring bodies identified by numbers and tasks, stripping away names, past occupations, and reasons for arrival. Thus, when he fled into the swampy wilderness following an incident no one fully agreed upon, the stories that emerged were already colored by the distortions of distance, fear, and the region's unresolved guilt. Those first days after his disappearance saw an unusual increase in the circulation of subtle and uncertain rumors. Travelers moving between the smaller settlements reported hearing accounts of a lone figure sighted at dusk, wading knee-deep through the reeds, a man whose clothing was torn but whose movements retained the unmistakable precision of an experienced guide. Others spoke of finding temporary shelters deep within the cypress groves, makeshift lean-tos constructed from fallen branches and mud, their interiors marked by the presence of footprints that suggested someone accustomed to sleeping lightly and abandoning a site quickly. These accounts were not officially documented in any sheriff's report, for few men in the region wished to admit how porous the edges of their settlements truly were, how easily a determined fugitive could vanish into the wilderness and re-emerge at a moment of his choosing. Instead, these rumors collected in the corners of taverns, in the dim gatherings outside trading posts, and in the hushed exchanges of field workers who had long since learned that the river carried news in the same way it carried debris, gradually, unpredictably, and with a tendency to deposit the most troubling fragments where they could not be ignored. Against this backdrop of swelling unease, the first hints of the disappearances emerged almost too quietly to be recognized as a pattern. A man from a logging crew failed to return after transporting a raft of stripped pines downstream. His colleagues assumed he had broken a leg navigating a slick incline or been caught beneath a shifting log. Yet when his skiff was later found drifting near the river's eastern bend, upright, unscratched, with a coil of rope perfectly coiled on the seat, Several men exchanged looks that betrayed an understanding they did not voice. Another absence soon followed. A teenage boy sent to collect traps set near the waterline failed to return to his home. His mother, frantic, reported the disappearance to a sheriff whose weary demeanor suggested he had already calculated the unlikelihood of locating the boy, though he offered what reassurance he could. The traps were eventually discovered in the mud, still intact, yet the boy's small fishing net lay half-submerged several yards away, as though dropped mid-stride. As whispers began to circulate linking these disappearances to the escaped convict, the atmosphere of the settlements tightened in subtle but unmistakable ways. Families forbade their children from venturing near the river except at midday, when visibility allowed one to see clearly both the reeds and the tree line. Logging crews began doubling their numbers, traveling in groups rather than alone. The few local clergy who still attempted to hold services in sparsely attended chapels spoke in their sermons of vigilance, moral decay, and the consequences of allowing men to slip beyond the reach of justice. Meanwhile, the river, indifferent to these human anxieties, carried on with the slow, ceaseless motion that had shaped the region for centuries, its banks trembling slightly when distant thunder rolled across the horizon. The oppressive tension of this environment crept into everyday interactions, revealing itself in small gestures. A farmer who paused too long before answering a neighbor's inquiry about livestock. A woman whose eyes darted instinctively toward the tree line whenever a branch snapped beneath the weight of a bird. A merchant who closed his store several hours earlier than usual without explanation. These were the gestures of a community aware that something unnatural, though not supernatural, was unfolding around them. Something rooted not in folklore or spectral tales, but in the all-too-real consequences of a system that had long relied on punishment rather than rehabilitation. Evidence of moral ambiguity also began to reveal itself through the behavior of those who knew more than they were willing to acknowledge. Several laborers admitted only in indirect comments that they believed the convict had been mistreated by guards, subjected to conditions that left him half-starved and dangerously unstable by the time he fled. Others recalled hearing raised voices between him and an overseer days before his disappearance, though these recollections shifted subtly with each retelling, becoming less certain yet more evocative. Some older residents, particularly those who remembered the turbulent Reconstruction years, suggested in hushed tones that the convict's escape might not have been entirely voluntary, that someone who wished to avoid public scrutiny for a past transgression might have found it convenient to let him vanish into the wilderness, thereby diverting attention away from certain administrative failures. None of these hypotheses were ever recorded officially, of course. They lived in the verbal margins of the community, preserved by those who sensed that truth often lingered just beyond the grasp of official narratives. The oppressive landscape reinforced the sense of suffocation that settled upon the region. Dense stands of longleaf pine cast elongated shadows that stretched across the ground like rigid bars, creating the visual impression of confinement even in open spaces. The river's breath, its humidity, settled on buildings, clothing, and skin, leaving the atmosphere heavy and damp, as though the land itself labored under the weight of unresolved history. The modest wooden homes, patched repeatedly over the years, bore weather-faded colors that suggested the constant struggle to remain upright against storms, rot, and economic hardship. Tools rusted quickly in the moist air. Boots sank into mud that seemed to cling with an almost deliberate persistence. This environment seeped into the psychological fabric of the residents, imprinting upon them a sense of dread that felt both environmental and moral, as though nature itself insisted on preserving the memory of past injustices. Against this backdrop, the first turning point manifested not through an act of violence, but through a discovery both minor and deeply unsettling. A hunter traveling near a seldom-used fork of the river stumbled upon a narrow clearing flanked by cypress roots twisted into grotesque shapes, their protrusions resembling skeletal fingers. In this clearing he found a small campsite, long abandoned yet still bearing signs of recent habitation. Ashes that retained warmth, a discarded scrap of cloth torn from prison-issued garments, and the unmistakable indentation of a man's body where he had slept on the damp ground. The hunter, though hardened by years of navigating the harsh terrains of East Texas, felt a sudden and unexplainable tightening in his chest as he surveyed the site. The placement of the bedroll suggested someone accustomed to sleeping with his back protected, facing the direction from which threats were most likely to emerge. The ashes indicated that the occupant had extinguished his fire with practiced urgency, and the fragment of cloth, smeared with mud and small flecks of dried blood, revealed a struggle of unknown origin. When the hunter reported this to the nearest sheriff, the official response was tepid at best. The sheriff, a man burdened by years of insufficient manpower and failing institutions, recorded the discovery with a weary hand, his pen dragging slowly across the page as though reluctant to commit yet another troubling detail to paper. He dispatched 2 deputies to inspect the site, but they returned with the same vague unease that the hunter had felt, offering no additional insights beyond the probability that the escaped convict had indeed used the location as a temporary refuge. Still, the sheriff posted no notice, issued no official warning, and did not organize a search party, perhaps believing that acknowledging the threat publicly would only spread panic he lacked the means to control. What truly marked the first shift in collective awareness was not the discovery of the abandoned campsite, but a subtle incident that unfolded a few days later along the riverbank. A farmer tending to his traps at dawn noticed a faint trail in the mud, footprints leading from the water's edge into the tree line. They were not the prints of a child or a woman, nor the heavy boots of a soldier or logger. These prints, narrow and deep, belonged unmistakably to a man accustomed to moving quickly through uncertain terrain. Yet what unsettled the farmer was not the presence of the footprints, but their direction. They led not away from the water, as one might expect of someone seeking concealment, but toward it, as though the man had emerged from the river itself, walking with deliberate steps toward the forest. The spacing indicated no hesitation, no uncertainty, only purpose. The farmer erased the prints with the back of his shovel before anyone else saw them, unsure why he felt compelled to conceal their existence. Perhaps it was fear of what the authorities might demand from him if he reported the discovery. Perhaps it was guilt, rooted in an instinctive recognition that the fugitive's suffering had not occurred in isolation, but had been shaped by the broader social order to which the farmer himself, however reluctantly, belonged. Or perhaps it was something more private, a desire to avoid confronting the possibility that the man moving through the wilderness was no longer guided solely by the instinct to survive, but by a deeper, more unsettling transformation wrought by neglect, cruelty, and isolation. And thus the first part of the story concluded with the region suspended in a fragile balance, whispers growing but unformed, fears swelling yet unspoken, and the river carrying its secrets with the slow patience of a force that had witnessed countless injustices long before these particular events began to unfold. The convict remained unseen, yet his presence, real or imagined, had infiltrated the consciousness of the settlements, shaping their behavior, their conversations, and their unspoken moral dilemmas. And though no one yet understood the gravity of what was beginning to take shape, the signs were already present, etched quietly into the land, the water, and the private terrors of those who sensed that the fragile order of their world was beginning to unravel. In the days that followed the first unspoken confirmations that something deeply wrong had begun to disturb the fragile order of the Sabine River settlements, a quiet yet unmistakable fraying of daily routines unfolded. It did not erupt into panic or overt expressions of alarm. Rather, it seeped into the ordinary motions of life, like moisture insinuating itself into the grain of a wooden beam, invisible at first, yet steadily swelling toward inevitable structural failure. The river, which had always provided the backdrop for toil, commerce, and reluctant contemplation, seemed to acquire a more watchful presence, as if it were absorbing the anxieties of those who lived beside it. Men who once ventured alone onto the water before dawn now waited for companions, their silence revealing more than their sparse conversations. Women paused longer at the threshold of their homes before sending children on errands, searching the path for disturbances that only they perceived. And the children themselves, sensitive to tensions adults attempted to conceal, began to behave with a subdued obedience that unsettled parents and used to such compliance. It was as though the entire region had entered a phase of involuntary vigilance, each inhabitant alert to threats they could neither name nor fully dismiss. Though few dared articulate their fears, the signs of disappearance continued to accumulate with increasing regularity. A trapper who regularly traveled between the settlements failed to arrive at his expected destination, his mule later found tied to a tree with its reins coiled neatly, but his tools abandoned in the mud. A fisherman's hat floated downstream for hours before lodging against the exposed roots of a water oak. Its owner did not return home that night, and though his wife attempted to convince herself that the swollen currents had stolen only his belongings, the tremor in her hands as she prepared supper betrayed a deeper understanding. Even the postal route, managed by a single rider responsible for navigating the long muddy roads carved through endless stands of pine, experienced interruption when the horse returned without its rider, saddle torn and spattered with marsh water. These events were not officially linked to any single cause, and yet the unspoken conclusions formed with swift and silent unanimity. Something, or someone, was moving through the region with a purpose that eluded comprehension. With the disappearances came the subtle emergence of moral dilemmas that pressed upon individuals with more weight than any sheriff's badge or community expectation. Some residents found themselves torn between reporting suspicious signs and concealing them, attempting to avoid the obligations that might follow disclosure. A logging foreman, upon finding a makeshift snare in a remote part of the timber tract, hesitated before informing authorities. He ultimately chose silence, fearing that a formal inquiry might halt operations and cost his workers their wages for the season. A pair of brothers who discovered scattered personal effects, buttons, a torn boot strap, and a powder flask emptied of its contents, buried the items rather than surrender them to the sheriff, convinced that involvement in the matter would bring scrutiny they could ill afford. These choices, seemingly small, contributed to the growing complexity of the situation, for each person convinced himself that protecting his family or livelihood justified withholding information that might have altered the course of community response. Whispers circulated in coded fragments, passed cautiously between individuals who feared both the truth and the consequences of speaking it aloud. Conversations in the trading post transformed into cryptic exchanges, where men referenced the one in the trees or the shadow by the bend, without naming names. In the lumber yard, workers developed a silent system of warning, an agreed-upon gesture involving the placement of a hat on a post, to indicate when someone suspected a stranger might be nearby. These signals were often ambiguous, based more on intuition than evidence, yet their prevalence indicated a widening belief that the vanished convict had begun to move with greater boldness, venturing closer to the settlements, perhaps even watching the inhabitants as they went about their tasks. At the same time, human betrayals, some subtle, others more deliberate, began to emerge as fear eroded the fragile bonds that had once held the communities together. The wealthier families, whose homes stood farther from the river and thus believed themselves safer, quietly instructed their field hands to report any sign of unfamiliar footprints or abandoned campsites. In doing so, they implicitly transferred responsibility for vigilance to those most vulnerable, demanding labor that was neither compensated nor free of risk. Some field hands complied out of fear of punishment, while others withheld information as a quiet act of resistance, unwilling to risk encounters with a fugitive driven by unknown motives. Merchants, worried about theft or disruption to their trade, subtly raised prices on goods rumored to be useful for outdoor survival: salted meat, dry matches, coarse blankets, without openly stating why. These actions, small in isolation, collectively revealed the moral fraying of a society faced with uncertainties it lacked the means or will to confront directly. Meanwhile, internal conflicts grew within individuals whose conscience warred with their instincts for self-preservation. The sheriff, though outwardly steady, found himself plagued by the recognition that he could not protect the region adequately. He reread old reports of the convicts' previous behavior, searching for patterns he might have missed. Yet the documents offered little more than procedural language, stripped of personal context: a list of infractions, a record of labor assignments, a brief notation regarding the prisoner's familiarity with river navigation. The sheriff's frustration deepened as he realized that the bureaucratic reduction of the man had rendered him unreadable. The very system designed to contain him had also erased all meaningful understanding of his psyche. The sheriff knew that fear, neglect, humiliation, and isolation could distort a mind beyond recognition, and he questioned whether the man now moving through the swamp was still the same individual who had once guided riverboats with steady confidence. But such reflections were dangerous luxuries for a man expected to uphold order, and he confined them to the late hours of solitary contemplation, when the office lamp flickered against the worn wood of his desk and the wind rattled the shutters like a restless spirit. The turning point of this period emerged through a sequence of events that, though outwardly unrelated, collectively marked the beginning of decisive shifts in community behavior. The first occurred when a young man, an apprentice carpenter known for his quiet diligence, confessed to his employer that he had seen a figure moving through the trees 2 nights prior. He described the silhouette as thin, bent slightly forward, moving with calculated precision rather than the erratic stumbling of a lost traveler. Yet the employer, fearing that such a report might lead to involvement he wished to avoid, instructed the apprentice to remain silent, offering him extra wages in exchange for discretion. This small betrayal, motivated by fear disguised as pragmatism, had consequences that neither man predicted, for it allowed the fugitive's movements to continue unimpeded. Another decisive moment came when a newly arrived preacher, a man driven by a fervent belief in divine providence, claimed from his pulpit that the disappearances were punishment for the region's moral failures. His sermon, delivered with trembling conviction, implied that someone among the congregation bore responsibility for provoking divine wrath. Though he did not name the convict explicitly, his insinuations ignited speculation that someone had aided the fugitive's escape. These accusations, however veiled, sowed discord within the community. Neighbors eyed one another with suspicion, old grievances resurfaced, and unspoken accusations simmered beneath outward civility. The preacher's rhetoric, though intended to inspire repentance, instead deepened fractures already present beneath the surface. The most significant turning point, however, unfolded when a man went missing under circumstances too explicit to ignore. A carpenter, older than the apprentice, known for his meticulous craftsmanship and steady temperament, failed to return from a job near the river. His tools were later found arranged neatly beside the unfinished structure, as though he had set them down with the intention of resuming work shortly. Yet tracks in the mud suggested he had been startled. One set of footprints veered suddenly toward the tree line, the spacing inconsistent with deliberate or purposeful movement. No signs of struggle were discovered, and no body surfaced, giving rise to whispered speculations that the fugitive had begun to select his victims more intentionally. The disappearance carried a weight that previous ones had not, for the carpenter was well-liked, respected, and integral to the community's daily functioning. His absence stripped away the illusion that only the marginal or solitary were vulnerable. Gray morality pervaded every decision that followed. Families debated whether to remain silent about observations that might implicate neighbors. Laborers argued quietly among themselves about whether aiding the authorities would improve safety or merely invite retaliation from both the fugitive and resentful employers. Even the sheriff faced a moral crossroads. To admit publicly the scope of the threat would invite panic and undermine confidence in his leadership, yet withholding information would leave people unprepared. In the end, he chose a path that lay uncomfortably between honesty and omission, issuing only a vague warning about unsettled activity along certain river passages, while privately preparing for the possibility that he might soon be forced to expand his investigation. Throughout these days and weeks, the region's tension grew steadily, not through violence, but through the quiet erosion of trust and the accumulating weight of private fears. Suspense did not arise from pursuit or confrontation. It emerged from the silence that thickened between individuals who once shared their burdens openly. It grew from the secrecy that cloaked even mundane actions, from the knowledge that cruelty, whether institutional, accidental, or born of desperation, had shaped the man moving unseen through the swamp. Human nature, and the systems that governed it, became the true source of dread, for everyone sensed that the boundary separating victim from perpetrator, innocence from complicity, was dangerously thin. By the time the last leaves of autumn clung to the branches above the river, the settlements had settled into a state of uneasy paralysis. No one spoke openly of the fugitive, yet everyone felt his presence in the altered rhythms of daily life. The silence surrounding the disappearances deepened, carrying the heavy implication that more would come. And though no one yet understood the full extent of what was unfolding, the region had already passed a threshold from which it could not return. The conflict had begun not through confrontation, but through the quiet, cumulative weight of fear, secrecy, and moral compromise, forces that would soon compel actions none of them could have imagined. In the weeks that followed the carpenter's disappearance, the region along the Sabine River began to slip from uneasy vigilance into something darker, a kind of resigned dread that clung to every waking hour and intruded upon sleep with a persistence that no rational explanation could alleviate. The authorities, already strained by limited manpower and the disintegration of post-war structures, found themselves overwhelmed by a threat they could neither define nor contain. The sheriff's patrols grew shorter, their routes confined to the most traveled paths, for even the deputies, accustomed to navigating the treacherous terrain, feared the deeper woods where the convict was rumored to have established his hidden refuge. Attempts to coordinate search parties dissolved into arguments about jurisdiction, compensation, and the risks involved, leaving behind only the hollow semblance of control. This weakening of authority manifested in subtle yet unmistakable ways. The courthouse door, once left open throughout the day, was now kept locked except during official hours. The nightly lantern at the jail flickered less often, either from neglect or a deliberate choice to avoid attracting attention, and the sheriff himself, burdened by sleepless nights and a growing sense of futility, often stared longer than necessary at the maps on his desk, tracing the serpentine river with a finger that trembled not from age but from fear of what he could no longer deny. It was during this period that the fugitive, The unnamed man, whose presence had already reshaped the region's rhythms, began to take deliberate action, moving with a calculated intent that revealed neither haste nor hesitation. Evidence of his movements surfaced in the most unsettling forms. A deer carcass left meticulously cleaned, as though to display his skill and control. A set of boot prints circling a remote homestead but never approaching its door, suggesting either restraint or an eerie fascination with the lives unfolding inside. And scraps of fabric, woven from untreated cotton and stained with river mud, found near a disused ferry crossing. These fragments, though seemingly insignificant, created a portrait of a man who had transitioned from mere survival to something more predatory, as though he were testing the boundaries of the community, observing its vulnerabilities, and choosing the moments that would allow him to influence events in his favor. Some believed he was hunting, not animals, but information, opportunities, and the weaknesses of those who feared him most. Others suspected he was seeking contact, attempting to reinsert himself into a world that had long ago discarded him. But the most troubling interpretation, spoken only in the most private conversations, was that he was neither fleeing nor hiding nor seeking help. He was luring, orchestrating a slow unraveling that served a purpose known only to him. Within the settlements, relationships that had once offered stability began to fracture under the pressure of suspicion. Families turned inward, unwilling to trust even long-standing neighbors with news of strange noises, unfamiliar tracks, or missing livestock. A man who claimed to have seen a fire flickering in the distance, too small for a camp but too large for a discarded ember, was accused by others of inventing the story to incite fear or gain attention. A woman who reported hearing movement outside her window at night found herself ostracized by those who believed she was attempting to assign guilt to individuals she disliked. The community's unity dissolved into avoidance, whispered accusations, and the quiet shunning of anyone who spoke too openly of the danger. Friendships cooled, alliances splintered, and even within households tension mounted as spouses disagreed on whether to protect their own interests or collaborate in the uncertain effort to contain the unseen menace. This internal fracturing, more than the fugitives' actions themselves, transformed the region into a landscape of moral uncertainty where every choice carried the risk of unintended betrayal. As fear deepened, individuals were forced into impossible moral decisions that exposed the fragility of their ethical convictions. A father who discovered footprints near his children's play area debated whether to relocate his family to a distant town, though doing so would mean abandoning his elderly parents, who depended on him for daily care. A laborer, pressured by his employer to serve as an informant and report any signs of suspicious movement among fellow workers, wrestled with the knowledge that complying would endanger those who trusted him, while refusing might cost him his livelihood at a time when jobs were scarce and hunger an ever-present threat. Even the schoolteacher, a woman whose life had been dedicated to instilling principles of truth and courage in her pupils, found herself hiding rumors from the children, fearing that honesty might burden them with terrors they were not equipped to navigate. These moral dilemmas, though hidden beneath carefully maintained facades of routine, eroded the community's collective sense of righteousness. The cost of silence and complicity grew heavier with each passing day, pressing upon every inhabitant like a weight on the chest that made each breath feel shallower than the last. The fugitive's presence reached a new and disquieting clarity when a hunter discovered the remains of a small riverside camp concealed beneath a curtain of low-hanging cypress branches. The camp was rudimentary yet oddly deliberate. A crude lean-to constructed from saplings, a fire pit arranged with skillful precision, and a scattering of objects that suggested both resourcefulness and a disturbing level of awareness. Among them were pieces of driftwood carved into rough shapes, faces with hollow eyes, long limbs ending in jagged edges, as though the man had attempted to capture or exorcise the visions that troubled him. Scraps of parchment bearing smudged charcoal markings lay pinned beneath stones, depicting what appeared to be maps of the river with exaggerated curves, dark shaded regions, and symbols whose meanings were indecipherable. Most unsettling of all were the remnants of what appeared to be a journal, though the pages were too damaged by moisture to be read. Only fragments of sentences remained legible. The water speaks, they do not see. The debt must be answered, and the river remembers. These fragments, though incoherent, left an impression that the man was not merely acting from desperation, but from a deep and tortured conviction shaped by the brutal circumstances of his past. News of the camp's discovery spread quickly, though the sheriff attempted in vain to suppress its details. The implications were unavoidable. The fugitive was not a transient presence, but an entrenched and watchful one, capable of both physical endurance and psychological cunning. Fear escalated into panic as individuals realized the man they once dismissed as a desperate escapee had transformed into a figure who observed them with a purpose they could not comprehend. It was during this time that letters and reports began to circulate, documents that would later serve as chilling testimony to the escalating horror. One letter, written by a storekeeper to his sister in another state, described how the air seemed perpetually heavy with the scent of decay and stagnant water, as though the river itself exhaled the remnants of unseen tragedies. Another report, penned by a deputy who resigned shortly thereafter, stated plainly that he believed the fugitive possessed an intimate understanding of their movements, noting that each time we prepare a search, he is already elsewhere, as if guided by whispers carried through the trees. These writings, though dismissed by some as exaggerations born of fear, reflected a growing belief that the boundaries between the natural world and the fugitive's psyche had blurred in ways that defied conventional logic. The first major confrontation occurred not through an organized pursuit, but through a chance encounter that left indelible marks upon the region's collective memory. A farmer who had ventured into the woods to repair a section of fence stumbled upon the fugitive standing on the opposite side of a shallow ravine. The man's appearance was startling, gaunt yet alert, with eyes that reflected neither madness nor malice, but a profound exhaustion mixed with an unsettling clarity. For a long moment, neither moved. The fugitive raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture that suggested a warning, then turned and disappeared into the forest with a fluidity that belied the weeks of pursuit he had endured. The farmer returned home shaken, unable to articulate the complex mixture of pity and fear that had seized him. His account, though mocked by some, marked the first time the fugitive had been deliberately seen since his escape, a moment that transformed him from a shadowy threat into a tangible, almost mythic figure whose motivations remained maddeningly obscure. Consequences of the conflict event grew more visible in the days that followed. Additional bodies surfaced along the river, not all intact and not all identifiable. Some bore injuries consistent with drowning, while others displayed marks that suggested violent struggle. A few showed no clear cause of death at all, their faces distorted by expressions of profound terror. These discoveries horrified the region and challenged the sheriff's already tenuous authority. Rumors spread that the fugitive was no longer acting alone, that he had developed a network of hidden sympathizers or forced companions. Others believed he had succumbed to madness induced by isolation, hunger, and years of systemic cruelty, transforming him into a vessel for something darker than personal vengeance. But the most terrifying speculation was the simplest, that he acted with full awareness, guided by a logic that those who had never known his suffering could not hope to understand. Guilt and trauma permeated every corner of the community as individuals grappled with their role in the unfolding tragedy. Those who had withheld information now feared they had allowed deaths to occur that might otherwise have been prevented. Those who had spoken to freely questioned whether their words had directed the fugitives' attention toward innocent people. Families of the missing vacillated between grief and anger, torn between mourning their loved ones and condemning the society that had failed to protect them. The sheriff, increasingly haunted by his inability to restore order, found himself writing reports that grew shorter with each passing day, as though language itself failed to capture the depth of the crisis. His private journal, discovered years later, contained entries that revealed the toll the events took upon his conscience. How many have died because I feared the truth? Is justice possible where the system is already broken? I am being undone by silence, my own and that of others. As weeks turned into a month, the atmosphere grew so heavy that even nature seemed complicit in the region's suffering. The smell of decay lingered constantly, mingled with wood smoke from cabins where families kept fires burning late into the night. The muddy ground seemed perpetually damp, as though rain fell even when the skies remained clear. Insects hummed with a relentless drone, their presence a reminder of life's persistence even amid despair. Every sensory detail pressed upon the inhabitants, weaving together an environment that felt at once oppressive and fragile, as though the entire world had been reduced to a single breath held in anticipation of the inevitable collapse. And beneath it all, beneath the fear, the guilt, the crumbling structures of authority, lay the unspoken recognition that the community itself bore responsibility for the man who haunted them. Their silence had allowed cruelty to flourish. Their complicity had shaped his suffering. Their indifference had permitted his escape to become a reckoning. Whether he sought vengeance, justice, or something beyond those simple terms, none could say. But all understood that the cost of their inaction was mounting, and the time for reckoning was drawing near. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke just after dusk, sweeping across the fields with a violence that felt less like weather and more like an accusation hurled from the dark. The sky split open in ragged streaks of white fire, illuminating the main house, the barns, the old smokehouse, and the narrow corridor of trampled grass leading toward the quarters. Every surface glistened with rain, every shadow jumped and convulsed in the lightning, and the entire plantation seemed to lurch in and out of existence with each flash. Within the house, doors trembled in their frames. On the gallery, wind tore at the shutters like something frantic trying to get in. And inside that suffocating, trembling space, the lies that had held for decades finally began to unspool under their own weight. It started quietly, with the same subtle wrongness that had been prickling at the edge of consciousness for days. A faint movement where no one stood. A breath of cold rising from the floorboards. The distinct sensation of someone leaning close behind you, whispering without sound. All of it so understated that a person could almost convince themselves it wasn't happening, until the house decided to reveal the truth in its own way. Footsteps echoed from the back hallway, too evenly spaced, too heavy, too deliberate to belong to any of the terrified servants who had barricaded themselves in the pantry. A door slammed upstairs with the force of a blow. Another swung open and shut, as if someone paced between rooms in a slow, circling pattern. The walls, swollen with moisture, groaned as if under a living weight. The house had always been prone to noises and storms, but these were not the bowing of timbers or the loosening of hinges. These were movements with intention, with memory, with hunger. By the time the lamps began flickering, no one still clung to the comfort of rational explanations. The clerk, exhausted from days of unraveling records and testimonies, pressed his back to the parlor wall, trying to listen past the thundering heartbeat in his ears. Across from him, the overseer's widow, ashen, trembling, clutched the small tin box that contained her late husband's unfinished letters. Her eyes darted upward whenever the ceiling thudded or creaked, and her lips moved constantly in silent prayer. Between them, the open ledger lay on the table, pages swelling from the damp, names smearing, ink bleeding into ink as if the dead were dragging their fingers across the parchment from beneath. When the next flash lit the room, Ruth was standing in the doorway. Or rather, someone stood there with her posture, her outline, her stillness, but water streamed from her clothes as if she had walked out of the river, and her face was half lost in shadow, features shifting in the flicker of the lamp. For a moment no one breathed. Rain roared outside. Somewhere in the back of the house, something toppled to the floor with a crash. Ruth said nothing, only lifted her hand with a slow, measured motion that made the air in the room tighten like a noose. The widow screamed. The clerk stumbled forward, unsure whether to run or help or speak. But the moment he took a step, the figure vanished, not with drama, not with spectacle, but with the quiet finality of a candle snuffed out. And yet the air she had occupied remained colder than the rest of the house. The floorboards beneath the doorway stayed wet long after the next gust of wind should have dried them. Whatever had arrived was not a hallucination, not a misjudged shadow, not a trick of lightning. It was a presence. It had shape. It had purpose. The confrontation did not come all at once. It crawled through the house like rising water, infiltrating each room, forcing every surviving soul into corners where they could no longer lie, not to each other and not to themselves. The clerk was the first to feel it directly. While rifling through the cabinet near the rear staircase, hoping desperately to find the missing 1848 inventory, he heard someone whisper his name with such clarity that the breath brushed the back of his neck. He spun around, lamp raised high, but the corridor was empty. Still, the voice persisted, threading through his thoughts with a steadiness that made it feel more like an accusation than a haunting. You wrote it down. You entered the numbers. You carried the pages. It wasn't true, not exactly, not in the way the voice implied, but it wasn't false either. He had been the one who kept records. He had been the one who quantified the lives of others into columns of ink. He had been the one who looked away because looking directly at suffering would have meant he bore responsibility for it. Another crash echoed upstairs, followed by a dragging sound like furniture scraping. No, not furniture. Something heavier. Something resisting. The wind howled, but its voice was overwhelmed by a second sound, an inhuman groan rising from somewhere deep within the structure. The house was not merely haunted, it was remembering. The overseer's widow reached her breaking point when the letters in the tin box began shifting on their own, sliding against one another with soft, papery whispers. She dropped the box, and it clattered across the floor, spilling the letters in a wide arc. The clerk rushed to help her gather them, but as his fingers brushed the topmost envelope, it split open, and the sheet inside unrolled like a tongue. Words appeared where the page had been blank only hours before, words written in a cramped, feverish hand that did not belong to the overseer. Words naming dates, punishments, hidden graves behind the north field. And at the bottom, smeared as if by a hand wet with river mud, Ruth. The lamps extinguished all at once. Dark swallowed the room so completely it felt like a physical force, pressing against eyelids even when eyes were open. The widow sobbed. The clerk fumbled for matches, but as he struck one, its flame bent sideways, not upward, not downward, but toward the far corner of the room, as if pulled by a draft no wind could create. He raised the match higher. Ruth stood there again. This time her face was visible, and the expression she wore was not rage, nor sorrow, nor the hollow look of the dead. It was expectation. She waited for them to acknowledge what they had seen, what they had done, what they had ignored. Her eyes held no mercy, but they held no malice either. They demanded truth. The clerk opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the house shuddered violently. A sound split the air, a wrenching, splintering tearing of beams giving way, and the ceiling above them partially collapsed, sending dust, plaster, and fragments of wood raining down. The widow screamed again. The clerk grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the doorway, but the path was blocked by another shadow, rising taller and broader than Ruth's, a shape the clerk recognized too late, the overseer. His features warped, sunken, half devoured by darkness, but unmistakable in posture and bearing. The widow collapsed to her knees. The overseer's shade did not move, but the temperature dropped so suddenly that breath crystallized in the air. And then, for the first time, the two figures, Ruth and the overseer, turned toward each other. There was no sound, but the violence of the moment was palpable, pressing against the walls, the floor, the lungs of everyone in the room. The house strained under the weight of it. Shadows twisted, buckled, recoiled. Ruth's form brightened with each flash of lightning, while the overseer's darkened, absorbing what little light remained. They were not merely ghosts confronting one another. They were the living embodiments of everything the land held: cruelty and defiance, suffering and resistance, the violence inflicted and the violence endured. The clerk understood, finally, that this confrontation was not for them, not the living, not the powerless spectators who had inherited the consequences of sins they neither committed nor prevented, but he also understood that something was demanded of him nonetheless. A truth, a statement, a reckoning. If he remained silent now, the house would collapse entirely, not just in structure, but in spirit, swallowing every living soul inside it. He stepped forward, and in the moment he opened his mouth to speak, the storm hit with its full strength, tearing through the gallery, shattering the front windows in an explosion of glass and wind. The lamps reignited as if ignited by the storm itself, casting the room into a hellish flicker of light and shadow. The confrontation reached its peak. The wind roared through the shattered windows, swirling the curtains upward like torn wings, scattering papers across the parlor as if the house itself were trying to shed the last remnants of its history. Rain lashed the floorboards, mixing with dust and plaster, turning the room into a blurred chaos of mud, ink, and splintered wood. Yet through all of it, through the storm, the shrieking gusts, the trembling of the walls, Ruth and the overseer remained locked in their silent confrontation, unmoving, unblinking, as if the world around them had ceased to matter. Every flash of lightning carved their figures deeper into the air, Ruth's form sharp and upright, the overseer's slumped and decayed, his outline sagging under the unbearable weight of what he represented. The clerk felt the room narrowing, closing around the three of them, as though the entire world had contracted to this single, suspended moment. His breath came in ragged bursts, not from fear now, but from the clarity seizing him with the force of revelation. He stepped forward again, the words forming not from courage but from necessity, from the undeniable sense that silence itself was participating in the crime. His voice cracked as he spoke, barely audible above the storm, but Ruth's eyes shifted toward him with slow, deliberate attention, grounding him, urging him to continue. The hum intensified. The shadow's edges pulled inward, folding in on themselves like wet paper shrinking in flame. The overseer's outline twisted, contorting into a shape almost unrecognizable, and with each contraction the room grew lighter, warmer, easier to breathe in. The storm outside softened, its rage diminishing as if drawn by an unseen tide. The house ceased trembling. The walls loosened their long-held groans. Even the rain, still slashing in from the broken windows, seemed less frantic, more like the tail end of a fever breaking. Finally, with a sound that was neither scream nor sigh, but something eerily in between, The overseer's presence collapsed into itself, shrinking until it was no larger than a shadow cast by a dying flame. And then it vanished completely, leaving the air trembling in its wake. Ruth stood alone in the center of the room. For several heartbeats, no one moved. The widow sobbed quietly behind the clerk, her body shaking with the force of release. The clerk himself felt hollowed out, emptied of the fear that had kept him captive for days. Weeks passed in a rhythm no longer dictated by clocks or schedules, but by the slow, uneven pulses of grief and relief that had settled over the plantation and the surrounding settlements. The storm that had marked the climax of terror left in its wake a landscape both scarred and strangely cleansed. Roofs had been repaired, fences patched, and windows shuttered against the occasional late gusts. Yet the people who survived carried inside them something unrepairable. Their days were filled with work, with tending to livestock, with harvesting crops from soil that had been soaked with rain, mud, and the residue of memory, but each task was heavy with recollection. The clerk, whose hands still trembled when he wrote, returned to his records with a cautious, almost reverent attention, aware that every name he inscribed now carried more than the cold abstraction of duty. It carried the moral weight of the vanished, of the wronged, of those who had suffered under silence. He added notes and margins where previously there had been none, writing the histories of absences as carefully as the histories of life, understanding that even numbers could bear witness when the ledger itself had been sanctified by horror. The widow, still fragile, moved among the remaining structures as though she carried the shadows of the departed with her. She spoke little, but when she did, her words were tinged with a sobriety that unsettled even the most pragmatic neighbors. She recounted glimpses of Ruth, or visions of her standing silently by the river, or walking through the woods as if the earth had parted for her passage. No one else could verify such sightings, and yet the stories circulated, reshaped into folklore by rumor and retelling. Children, warned by hushed whispers, refused to venture near the riverbank after dusk, leaving the main road empty save for those whose necessity overrode fear. Even those who did not witness anything spoke as though a ghost hovered in the periphery of their awareness, shaping their movements, their conversations, and their moral choices. In the weeks that followed, the town and the plantation alike attempted to reclaim order, but the attempts were always partial, hesitant. Conversations avoided certain topics. Newcomers were warned, subtly, about the river, the woods, the missing, the dead. Anyone who inquired directly was met with measured caution, half-truths, or outright silence. The clerk noticed the change most acutely in himself. He recorded, he preserved, he documented, but he no longer trusted the ledger to contain justice. Names were written, pages filled, but he felt the weight of omission. What could not be captured, the lives that existed between columns and margins, the moral compromises no ink could record. He wrote letters to distant relatives, attempting explanations, yet each letter circled around the unnameable. He feared they would not understand, but feared even more the danger of leaving the truth unspoken. The river, too, resumed its slow, secretive movement, indifferent to the human concern it had inspired. Boats traversed its bends with caution, guided by memory rather than maps, for maps could not chart the presence of a mind that had once known every hidden cove, every submerged route, every twist in the current. Fishermen returned to the banks, but with a silent acknowledgement that the water had changed in ways that could not be undone. Some nights, shapes appeared on the distant shore, just beyond the reach of lantern light, figures that might have been reflections, might have been memories, or might have been Ruth herself, passing between the living and the unseen. No one approached, and perhaps no one could, for fear itself had become a protective boundary, an unspoken code of conduct that kept both witness and mystery intact. The main character, who had faced the fugitive in the hours of the storm, remained haunted, though not physically harmed. He carried with him a quiet understanding of complicity and culpability, of survival and responsibility, that weighed heavier than any injury could. He walked along the river alone sometimes, tracing the water's edge, examining driftwood, and reflecting on the human capacity for cruelty, for denial, and for endurance. He saw in every broken branch, every flattened path, every disturbance of the undergrowth, a metaphor for the choices that had been made, which lives were preserved by attentiveness, which were destroyed by indifference, and which were claimed by a moral reckoning that no one had anticipated. His sleep was shallow, haunted by visions of faces, by the scent of mud and decay, by the voices of those who had not survived and the weight of those who had. Letters and journals emerged during these weeks, some left by the fugitive, some by those who had died in silence, some by the clerk, attempting to reconcile what had happened. Each document contributed to the slow construction of memory. The fugitive's own handwriting, fragments carried downstream or pinned to trees by unknown hands, offered cryptic instructions, reminders, warnings, and moral riddles that challenged the community to reconsider the nature of justice. The pages were smudged, waterlogged, and often illegible, yet the intention behind them was unmistakable. Witness, remember, and reckon. Those who handled these letters felt a chill that was not merely from the river's damp breath, but from the realization that human action and human inaction had created a chain of consequences far beyond any one person's capacity to fully comprehend. Rumor and legend intertwined with fact as survivors interpreted events in ways that suited their own needs or their own fears. Some described Ruth as a protector, a spectral judge ensuring that the guilty recognized their sins. Others whispered that she was vengeance incarnate, exacting what the law could not deliver. Stories were reshaped, names obscured, and nights spent beside hearths became punctuated with cautionary tales. Yet for all the embellishment, the moral core persisted. Cruelty breeds reckoning, silence enables it, and the river, patient and deliberate, would witness and remember far beyond the lifespans of those who feared it. Even with time, the social fabric remained altered. Families that had hidden secrets now spoke in measured tones, aware that the past could surface unexpectedly, unbidden. The clerk, continuing his work with the ledgers, began incorporating oral histories, testimonies, and fragments of conversations into official documentation, not merely as a record of loss, but as a moral archive, a testament to human frailty and resilience alike. Neighbors who once squabbled over land or resources found themselves bound by a shared understanding of vulnerability, of the limits of authority, and of the profound, unassailable truths that had been revealed by events none would forget. And the river itself flowed onward, silent yet omnipresent, its currents indifferent to the judgments of man, yet carrying them nonetheless, folding memory and morality together beneath its surface. In the final days of the month, the clerk walked the boundaries of the plantation and along the riverbanks where the storm had first struck. He saw the trees bent but unbroken, the mud hardened into ridges that mapped the flood's passage, and the scattered remnants of boats and nets washed against the banks. He paused frequently, tracing shapes with his fingers, reading the landscape as one reads a document, understanding that the river had written a history no ledger could fully contain. He felt the weight of choices made, not just by the fugitive or by Ruth, but by every individual who had lived in proximity to the unfolding horrors, and he realized that responsibility was neither singular nor evenly distributed. It was collective, cumulative, a web of complicity and courage, of fear and conscience, stretching across every path and river bend. As he returned to the main house, evening descended slowly, painting the walls and windows in a muted palette of gray and shadow. The widow had moved quietly to a corner, arranging the scattered letters, her hands steady but her eyes distant. The clerk approached and spoke little. Words were insufficient, and they had always been so. Instead, he placed the letters in order as best he could, arranging evidence of events, moral choices, and human suffering in a tableau that spoke louder than speech. Together, they understood the unspoken truths, that memory must be preserved, that silence can be a form of violence, and that justice, if it could be named at all, was as much a matter of witnessing as of acting. In the days that followed, those who remained worked and lived under a tentative truce with the past. The river, ever patient, carried the remnants of tragedy downstream, mixing them with the currents that no one controlled, yet which everyone depended upon for sustenance and survival. Survivors moved among the fields and homes with a quiet vigilance, aware that any misstep might invite echoes of the events they had endured. Children, growing older, asked questions in hushed tones, and adults, recalling the events, chose words carefully, understanding that stories could preserve truth without necessarily imparting fear, yet recognizing that fear itself could sometimes be the most faithful teacher. And so, the legacy of the events along the Sabine River took shape, not in monuments or official proclamations, but in whispers, in journals, in the careful preservation of names and deeds. The main character remained, walking among the living and the remembered, carrying the burden of knowledge and the necessity of reflection. He understood that the river would continue, as would memory, as would the moral reckoning that human cruelty and human endurance engender. The story became both caution and testament, that oppression leaves traces long after the immediate actors are gone, that silence is complicit, and that witnessing is itself an act of responsibility. The documentary lens, had one been present, would have lingered on the quiet, somber aftermath. The river's edge glistening in morning light, a ledger left open on a table, pages marked with names, with crosses beside some, with blank spaces for others. It would have shown the clerk walking slowly through the fields, the widow arranging letters with care, the community tending to daily life, yet carrying unseen burdens, all framed against the indifferent sweep of nature, the persistence of memory, and the ever-present question of human accountability. The moral questions posed to the audience are immediate and uncomfortable. How far does complicity extend before it becomes guilt? How do societies reckon with acts that are at once private and systemic? Can survival justify moral compromise? And if so, at what cost? And finally, what does it mean to remember those who cannot speak for themselves, when memory itself may be the only conduit for justice in a world that has so often failed it?